Good afternoon and welcome to our weekly Lunch Bite webinar series from Interface Systems. Once again, my name is Brooke Kaiser and I'm the Marketing Coordinator for Interface Systems. Our Director of Consulting Services, Lou Smith, will be presenting today on file storage and search in Office 365. We hope you enjoy the webinar, and if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A toggle feature at the bottom of your screen. We look forward to presenting to you today. And Lou, I'll hand the presentation over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lou Smith. I'm a member of the Interface Systems team. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar regarding file storage and search within Microsoft 365. This is a topic, one of many topics, I should say, that we consistently discuss with various different types of organizations. Many times we find companies have moved to Microsoft 365 primarily for email and maybe a couple of other underlying functions. However, the real true power comes in as you start to expand your footprint within the tool set that you're really already paying for and you don't need to pay any more for to leverage some of these other pieces. File storage is a key piece of that, and there tends to be some confusion and some concern regarding where to store files. So when you look at Office 365 specifically, there are three key areas where you can store data or files. And when I say files, I'm talking specifically about things like Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, Excel files, etc. And those three locations are OneDrive, SharePoint Online, and Microsoft Teams. So let's go ahead and jump on over to our test tenant here and dive into each one separately. Okay, here we go. So I am logged into my test tenant as my test user, Enrico, and you can see that I'm in my OneDrive right now. Think of OneDrive as your personal storage. Every single person within the organization has a OneDrive associated to them, and it is a location where they can store their files and synchronize them locally to their computer. You may be storing your personal files on your hard drive on your computer within your My Documents folder. A lot of people store it right on their desktop. You may have a home drive that's redirected to a server somewhere in your infrastructure. But for Office 365, you all get this space to store your data. It's a fantastic place to keep it in case you have a hard drive failure and you need to get back online and bring your data back. You simply just synchronize this data back to your workstation once you do. But the key with this is it's private. And if you look at the sharing column here with all of my folders, I have two at the top, and all of my files underneath, you see that the sharing level is private. These are my files. No one else can access them. In order for someone to gain access to this, I, as the person that owns this folder, need to give them access. And you can simply do so by clicking on the share link here. For each one of the files, you can actually do it at a folder level as well. But think of this as the place where I store my work in progress files. It's not ready for prime time. I'm trying to generate the content and working on that as part of my to-do list, and this is where I store it before I'm ready to place it to another location where I may want to collaborate with the team. Which brings us to our next location for file storage, and that's SharePoint. Now, SharePoint as a whole has many different functions, features, options, etc., that are available within that platform. File and document storage is simply one aspect of it, but it's one that a lot of organizations leverage because of the granular controls that you can gain around permissions. Now you can see that I'm in a marketing site here that's been created as a part of my test tenant, and there's a lot of customization that's been done on the main screen with some news activity, etc., but you also see a document section that's been exposed on the right-hand side. Over on the left navigation, you actually see that same document repository or document file library, and I can click on that and open it. The look and feel of this is practically identical to what OneDrive looks like when you go between the two, and Microsoft does that on purpose just to help increase usability. But if you look at this, you can see multiple different people are in here accessing and modifying these files. And you can control who has access using tools that you may have in your infrastructure, like Active Directory. Anytime someone comes on board, you add them to a specific group, and that will give them access to certain locations within SharePoint. A great way to control security around documents and centrally share all of that data. Now, moving on to the collaboration piece of this, and really where the rubber meets the road, in my opinion, is within Teams. And if you've been within Teams and utilized the Files tab within any of the channels that you've seen that you have multiple different files, or you may have multiple different files in yours. Within my test tenant here, I have a handful of different files within my design files folder, my design channel. If I go over to the digital assets web channel and click on files, you can see that I only have one file stored here, and so on and so forth. As I go through my different channels, I can see that I have various different documents stored within. PowerPoint presentations, Excel files, etc., whatever the team is collaborating on. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, we talked about permissions with SharePoint. Permissions are controlled very well within Teams also. However, it's really up to the team owner as to who has access. So any member of this X1050 launch team that I'm on here can see any files within any of the public channels that are available. And like I said, it's controlled by whoever's managing that team. So Megan, who's an owner, Nestor, who's an owner, they can add people to the team, they can take people away. As applies with SharePoint, the key here is making sure that users only store appropriate files in appropriate locations, just to make sure that something isn't by mistake placed in a location that has some sensitivity and more people have access than should have access to it. But there's one thing to note about the file storage within Teams. As you go into the channels and you see all of the files that are here, technically under the covers, this is still SharePoint. When you create a team within Microsoft Teams, there are a lot of processes that run in the back end to create other resources for that team, one of which is creating a SharePoint file repository. And actually, if you look at the top of the screen here, you'll see an Open in SharePoint option. If you click on this, it will open a SharePoint screen just like what we saw in our marketing team document library, but I'm seeing it for the X1050 launch team. In my documents section, same exact files that I see, just like when I was in my marketing team site, and I can see all of the different files that are stored here. The difference here is the general document library in a larger SharePoint site is controlled a little bit differently than the document library associated to a Teams created site or a group associated to that team. Whoever has access to the team can see the files. If I have a general SharePoint site that has no link to Teams whatsoever, it's controlled by however I set my permissions, preferably using groups in Active Directory and other tools of the sort. Now, one of the bigger questions that comes up when we talk about these different locations, okay, I have personal files in OneDrive, I might have some files in my marketing team site in SharePoint, and I may have some files in my design channel for my X1050 launch team. I can't remember where I stored this document. How in the world do I find it? Well, there are a couple of very good ways that you can do so. Namely, if you remember it's in SharePoint, you can come and click on the search this library option and search within SharePoint. You can do the same thing and search within Teams up in the top command line here. But there's also a better way to do it, and there's two that I'd like to call out. The first is if you log into office.com with your Office 365 credentials, basically your dashboard is what comes up with recent files, etc. Up at the top here, you can activate something that's called Microsoft Search. So if I search for X1050 as an example, once my results come up, you'll see all of the different files that pop up. And actually, it doesn't just show files. So you see all is selected here, but I can click on files specifically, see that I'm getting results from my OneDrive. I'm getting results from my OneNote for my X1050 launch team notebook. I'm getting results from SharePoint, results from Teams, you name it. I can also click on sites. So I see that there's a couple of different teams created here. I can click on people. Now there's no people called X1050, but this actually brings up a really good point. Let's search for Megan Bowen here. If you're looking for a person in the organization, if your organization is large enough where you need to do so, you can do the same thing here. You can also take a look at the sites that they're active in, some of the files that they've updated recently, locations, etc., even if there's some news tied to them. So it looks like there was a meeting that was posted on the marketing site that Megan had published a while ago. So very powerful way to search across all of those different locations and pull data back. But you may actually use a little bit of a different way to search. Let's say that you go to Bing.com. So Bing is my search engine by default, potentially as a user within this organization. When I log into Bing with my Office 365 credentials and I go to do a search, initially you're going to notice something that happens right here in Internet Explorer where Microsoft Search opens, and I can see recent files, set up a meeting, all sorts of different functions that are available to me. But if I do that same search from Bing when I'm logged in, of course, it brings up all these different web results as you would imagine it would. But up here, I can also show results from my company. Now, this says show results from Contoso. For me, it says show results from Interface Systems. And whatever your company name is, it would show the following. So when I click in, I can see, oh, wait, there's a X1050 launch team. There's some sites that reference X1050, SharePoint sites, a team site, files that reference the term X1050, Teams conversations that are referencing X1050 within them. So two very powerful ways to conduct your search across the landscape of those three key locations that you can search in within Microsoft 365. I hope this webinar was helpful to help you understand a little bit better way to maybe store files or where you might want to store files within Microsoft 365 and how you can find those files after you've done so. Feel free to reach out at any point in time if you have questions. My contact information is on the screen. Feel free to also to check out some of our other future webinars on interfacesystems.com/webinars.
Thanks, Lou. Thank you again for joining us today. As always, questions are welcome. So we ask that you use the Q&A feature. Lou, it looks like we do have one question in the queue right now. If you'd like to take a peek at that.
That sounds great. And I actually have a private one that was shot to me as well. So the question in the queue, we're struggling with how we use and what goes into SharePoint versus Teams versus Outlook, some best practices. This is really at the heart of the biggest conversation that we have when we talk about file storage. Why do we put something where, and what are our rules around that? When we talk about SharePoint versus Teams, one of the big delineating factors, or deciding factors, I should say, is determined by how your teams are set up. So if I have a project team that's focusing on a big project, it makes most sense many times to place all of those files within the team and share it as such within the channels within the team accordingly. However, what we're finding is a lot of organizations are leaning more towards SharePoint for two things. The first is if they're migrating data from an older file server or file storage from another platform, typically they'll put it in SharePoint as a way that they can globally share it across the entire organization as a part of that migration. Separately, and kind of along those same lines, typically we see that organizations are leaning more towards SharePoint for more of the global files. We see organizations that will create one document library for the entire company and it is separated by different folders. We also see companies that are creating separate SharePoint sites by functional units within the organization as well. So it really depends on how you're operating to determine the proper answer to that question. I wish there was a one-size-fits-all answer to that, but in every single organization, everyone operates so differently. It really depends on how you're setting up, how you're operating on those two different platforms. Great question, though. Number two, for the external sharing in OneDrive that you referenced, how does that work for external users? Another good one. All right, so external users that have data shared with them, whether it's from OneDrive or from SharePoint, I'll toss out there, you can set it up a couple of different ways. So typically we prefer to set it up in a fashion that requires a Microsoft account. These are free accounts that anyone can sign up for in order to access that data. You do have the capability to create what's called a guest access level as well. And really what that means is you generate a link to a repository and anyone that has that link can access it. We're not big fans of that just because of the potential security concerns that might come with that. Anyone that gets their hands on that link can access it. But having that Microsoft account is nice because not only does it control and force them to use a username and password, but that also logs that account within Office 365 within AD. So you can see what is there, what they have access to, and revoke that from an administrative level in the future as well. Those are the only questions that I see, Brooke.
Okay, great. Well, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact Lou at lsmith@interfacesystems.com. And as always, we appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great day.